So I want to start by welcoming everyone to the second event for this year's Sociology Colloquium series. And this is sponsored by the Social Science Student Donation Fund. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Katie Mendez, and I'm going to be chairing the event today, which I organized alongside Howard, and Amy has also provided really excellent support. So even though this is a virtual event, I want to begin by welcoming everyone to Western University. And I want to acknowledge that Western is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenape, and the Attawandaron peoples. Okay, so I'm really delighted to welcome Dr. Jenjira Yahirun, who's Assistant Professor in Sociology in the Department of Sociology at Bowling Green State University, which is located in Bowling Green in Ohio. So Dr. Yahirun's work looks at how the family as an institution contributes to social inequality. And in this work, she investigates three major themes. So the first is how families shape individual health outcomes. The second is how increasing family complexity and diversity challenges the kinship safety net. And thirdly, how migration affects ties to kin. And what cuts across all of this work is the finding that gender, race, ethnicity, and social class stratify access to resources. And this has significant implications for how the linked lives of family members contribute to disparities in health and well-being. So Dr. Yahirun has published her work in a number of high-quality journals and edited collections, including the Journal of Marriage and Family, International Migration, the Journals of Gerontology, and Research on Aging. So taking an intersectional approach, Dr. Yahirun is going to speak to us today about whether offspring educational mobility is tied to parents' dementia onset, and whether these associations vary for Black versus white parents in the States. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Yahirun, who will have up to 40 minutes to speak, and this will be followed by a Q&A. So I really look forward to hearing what Dr. Yahirun's going to say, and with that, I'll hand it over to her.
Thanks so much for that really great introduction. I'm going to start sharing my slides, and then you can just give me a thumbs up if this works. All right, so good morning. I'd like to thank Dr. Mendez, Dr. Ramos for inviting me to speak today about my recent work that looks at racial disparities, intergenerational relationships, and older parents' cognitive health. So just to give you a brief roadmap of where we're going to go today, I'll first start with some overall motivation behind this body of work. Then I'm going to dive more deeply into two studies. The first study was recently published. It looks at kind of education of multiple family members, so thinking about kind of 3 generations of family members, how their education affects the likelihood of becoming cognitively impaired. And then the second study is really this work in progress that looks at Black-white differences in this link between children's education and parents' dementia risk, but really also takes into account the fact that the processes by which people achieve their education can also matter for parents' health outcomes. So not just thinking about kind of the finite schooling that children achieve, but also what that schooling means in relationship to parents' own education. So first of all, most of you are probably familiar with the social determinants of health framework. So this dominant kind of research area focuses on individual level determinants and processes. So here in this really simplified model, we have an individual who goes on to achieve a certain level of schooling. And that level of schooling, for example, if they achieve a high level of schooling, can lead to rewarding jobs, higher income, which then leads to good health outcomes. If we expand upon this and think about how kind of intergenerational processes or parent-child relationships may be affecting people's health outcomes, most of the research on intergenerational relationships or parent-child relationships tends to focus on kind of these downstream effects. So thinking, for example, about how the education of parents might affect children's health, and then kind of subsequently that child's health in adulthood and later life as well. So there's direct effects and implications here. So we can think about, for example, parents who have high levels of education, secure kind of a good, healthy environment for children. And that then goes on to have its own kind of health benefits in later life. But we also know that there's also a strong link between having highly educated children and then also, having highly educated parents and the link to having highly educated children. And then that child's education itself also exerts kind of an effect on their own kind of income, the jobs that they have, and then their health in later life as well. So the question that I'm mostly focusing on today tries to account for potential upstream processes. So thinking not just about how kind of, these early life conditions might be affecting someone's health. Sorry, can you see when I move the arrow over here? Can you see it now? Okay, so not just thinking about kind of these early life conditions and how they affect people's health, but also thinking about, for example, how having a child, that child's education can also have a subsequent effect on health in later life. So at this point, you might be saying, okay, how is it and why is it that we should be focusing on parent-child relationships? What does that have to do with health? Well, there are a few demographic facts that I want to go over that kind of make the study of parent-child relationships especially important. So the first is that we know that marriage rates have been decreasing in the United States in general. Divorce rates have also been increasing, although they've kind of tapered off since the 1980s. At the same time, fertility rates have also been decreasing as well. So this suggests that spouses or partners may no longer be kind of that norm or that kind of the person who's going to be there throughout the life period, throughout your life course. Even though fertility rates are decreasing, women are having fewer children, which suggests that the children that they do have, there may be more time or investment in those children in particular. Another factor to remember is that life expectancy is increasing, and this has been pretty much, we can see this across all racial and ethnic groups. And so the share of life that people spend as a parent or as a child also increases. And with older age, we know that paid labor force participation tends to drop. Older adults' social networks are smaller than working adult social networks, but the social networks that remain tend to be composed of family members. And so here we see really the potential for family members, spouses, and in particular adult children, to become these really important sources of social, financial, and instrumental support. Oops, sorry. Okay, so I also want to briefly mention how this work fits into kind of the broader literature on racial disparities in health. So prior to this, I've just been talking about kind of education, kind of expanding upon the social determinants of health framework by thinking about these intergenerational processes. But when we think about kind of racial disparities in health, again, most of this research also thinks about kind of individual level resources and individual level health outcomes. This research tends to focus on looking at differences between racial groups. So for example, focusing on the Black-white mental health gap or physical health gap or longevity gap. A lot of this research tends to be undergirded by what we refer to as a resource deficit perspective. So if we focus so much on the individual, we tend to think about kind of what is, how these racial disparities are really linked to kind of either behavioral differences or just resource differences between groups, without kind of paying attention to kind of the more kind of systemic or institutional reasons why these resource disparities exist, and then how that links to kind of these health disparities. In addition, one of the criticisms that's coming out of this literature is that when we focus on only looking at kind of the health gaps between racial groups, we really miss an important piece of the discussion, which is looking at heterogeneity within racial groups. So thinking, for example, about how education, what the role of education might be kind of within racial groups, as opposed to kind of looking only across racial groups. And I'll get more to this when I get to my last study, when I'll talk a little bit more about this as well. Oops. Okay. And then finally, I just want to make an argument about why I'm looking at cognitive health in general, and not just kind of other types of health indicators. So we know that, I showed you that graph with increasing longevity in the United States, but despite increasing longevity in the United States, the number of older adults living with Alzheimer's and other dementias, so ADRD, is growing in the United States and in worldwide. ADRD, cognitive decline in general, really has a strong effect on deteriorating the quality of life, not only among the people who actually experience cognitive impairment, but also among caregivers, and particularly family members, who have to kind of handle how to handle the challenges of increasing cognitive impairment among these older family members. At the same time, we know that age and education are the strongest predictors of cognitive decline. And because education is a modifiable resource, we see kind of an opening or an opportunity. And then finally, one of the reasons why we're looking at cognitive health is because the racial disparities in cognitive health are really immense. So recent data, for example, show that Black older adults are 2 to 3 times more likely than whites to actually experience dementia at any point in time. And at least part of this is due to educational disparities between racial groups. So, okay. So the studies, so my research agenda is really focused on these 2 questions. Is first, how do adult children's resources shape parents' cognitive health and well-being in later life? And then the second question is whether or not kind of the link between children's resources and parents' health varies both across and then also within racial groups in the United States. So I just want to mention today that this work really builds on research that I have been doing with really fantastic collaborators across a number of institutions. And I also want to highlight the interdisciplinary nature of this work. I know this is a talk today in a sociology colloquium in department, but this work has really been informed by kind of my collaborations with economists, epidemiologists, and population health scholars, in addition to sociologists as well. Sorry, I'm having some trouble advancing my slides. Let's see. Okay, here we go. So the first study looks at the education of multiple family members and kind of these processes, how the education of multiple family members can affect older adults' likelihood of cognitive impairment. And both of the studies that I'm going to talk about today are collaborative works with Sindhu Basareddy. She's a postdoc at the International Institute for Population Studies in India, and Mark Hayward at University of Texas at Austin. So the main purpose of this study is to look at these 3 generations of family members. So thinking about parents' education, parents' education, respondents' own education, and then an adult child's education, and how that is linked to later life cognitive health. So the first part of this thinks about kind of those early life conditions, and this is really informed by this literature that looks at the long arm of childhood. And here, this kind of hypothesis here is that regardless of what social status one achieves as an adult, those early life conditions really do matter. And so early on, there were papers to show, for example, that parental education and parental occupation matter for longevity in a way that goes beyond kind of the status, one's own education, one's own occupation. This type of research has been repeated across kind of numerous different types of health outcomes and across social contexts as well, and also shown to be kind of effective also for cognitive impairment, such that childhood poverty, childhood health, parental education, parental occupation, all have an effect on the likelihood of becoming cognitively impaired in later life. There's also research now to show that there are potential upward transfers in health as well. So there's been less research looking at cognitive health outcomes among older adults, but most of this research shows that higher levels of children's schooling, for example, are positively associated with parents' longevity, increasing parents' longevity, and decreasing kind of physical health challenges among older adults. And this work has really been looked at across a variety of contexts in East Asia, in South Africa, for example, and in North America, United States, and Mexico. With kind of robust results suggesting that this relationship exists regardless of the types of institutional support that exists for older adults, and also potentially differences in cultural norms in support for older family members as well. But there's been less research looking at cognitive health outcomes. So recent studies in South Korea do show that there is a link between having highly educated offspring and slower rates of cognitive decline among older parents. And in China, a recent study looked at how historical increases in child schooling led to higher rates of cognitive performance among parents as well. The question then still remains whether or not we would see this in the US context. And so that's kind of the main purpose of this study. So we see this in East Asia. Do we see this in the United States? Will we see this in the United States? So at this point, you might be asking, okay, so tell me about how this could possibly be the case. What are the potential mechanisms that link adult children's education and parents' cognitive health outcomes? So here I have kind of this very rough schemata of the ways in which children's education could potentially affect parents' cognitive health outcomes. So obviously, when adult children have high levels of schooling, this could lead them to have more income, right? And better jobs. So those are two things I mentioned earlier when looking at kind of the individual level determinants and social determinants of health. More income means potentially more financial transfers to parents, and then also kind of jobs that allow for more flexibility and more control over one's schedule could potentially lead also to time transfers to parents as well. All of this leads to kind of improved or family, social, and economic conditions. For example, children having more time to spend with their family members, with their parents. It would lead parents themselves to have kind of less strain on their household finances, improved material conditions, and then also kind of allow for family social engagement. We know that social engagement is kind of, and cognitive engagement in general, leads to better cognitive health outcomes in later life. All of these could also affect parents' health, intermediary health behaviors, and health outcomes. So for example, prior literature has suggested that when adult children don't achieve milestones like high school completion, for example, or kind of parental expectations about jobs and kind of unemployment, parents do experience worse health, for example. This also can have an effect on parents' psychological well-being, mental health, and stress. There's also research to suggest a correlation between adult children's education, having higher levels of adult children's education, and also parents' treatment of diabetes and hypertension. All of this then, kind of these different pathways then go on to affect parents' cognitive health. So the research question that I'm addressing with this specific study is whether or not there's a link between offspring college education in particular and parents' likelihood of becoming cognitively impaired, and then whether or not this association remains net of parents' own education and that of their parents as well, so that earlier generation too. So to address these questions, we use data from the Health and Retirement Study, which many of you might be familiar with. It's a study that began in 1992. And data are collected every 2 years. It is nationally representative of the US population for adults over age 50. And the HRS continually has kind of new cohorts and replenishment of the survey so that it continues to be representative of that age population. A really nice feature of the HRS that distinguishes it from other panel studies is that the respondents are, of course, asked questions about all of their health outcomes and their own socioeconomic status, but also parents or these respondents are also asked questions about all of their adult children, regardless of whether or not the adult children live with them. So many studies, for example, will ask questions about children who co-reside with parents and tend to neglect asking questions about, those children who live outside the household. So with this study, with this data set, we're actually able to kind of get an overview of all of the children, regardless of where they live. I use the RAND versions, which are the somewhat cleaned versions of these files. The sample is restricted to people who were present in the survey from 2000 to 2012. We look at adults age 65 and older, which is an age cutoff that we use because cognitive health and dementia in general tend to deteriorate, not after age 50 necessarily, but usually in kind of later, older adulthood. So after age 65, we have a number of exclusions that we make, but the most important one is that we exclude people who are obviously missing on the dependent variable here, cognitive health measures. Oh, I also wanted to note, we look at adults with children we only look at the education of children who are 25 and older. We don't look at children who are younger than that because we assume that by age 25, most children, adult children will have completed whatever education they will complete at that age. So we measure cognitive impairment using scales. So different types of scales. The important thing to note here is that we have information on respondents who themselves were able to respond to the survey and ask them questions about kind of tests of kind of word delay and word recall, numeracy, tests of kind of cognitive awareness about kind of political affairs or who's the president. They were also asked questions about naming kind of, what today is. So kind of a variety of measures that were used to measure cognitive impairment. The important thing to take note of is that we include measures for people who were able to respond themselves to the person who was asking the survey questions, but also we have information on proxy respondents. So in the HRS, when people were not able to answer the survey, there was a proxy who kind of came in and responded for that person. And obviously among proxy respondents, you can imagine that many of these individuals are already cognitively impaired. And so there were questions that were asked that were different of the proxy respondents, but still tried to get at kind of these underlying conditions of cognitive impairment. The main explanatory variable that we use here is children's college education. And here we're looking, from the parent's perspective, we're looking at all of the children's college completion. So we look at whether or not a parent had no child who completed a college education, by which we're defining 16 or more years of education. We looked at parents with some college educated children, and then parents who had all of their children who completed a college education. And you can see that actually only about 14% of parents had no children who completed a college education, and that the sample was pretty much divided between parents with some and all of their children who completed college. We also controlled for a number of both respondent and respondent early childhood characteristics, including, of course, the respondent's own education, and then also these early childhood conditions, including the respondent's parents' education. So this is where we get at kind of the education of multiple family members, both the respondent and their parent. And we're looking at kind of the education of children as a composite. So we use discrete time event history models, which basically just predict in any given time period. In our survey, our observations are every 2 years. So we looked at any 2 years, whether or not there was a transition from having good cognitive health to poor cognitive health. And we use a progressive adjustment strategy, and it might just be easier to show you what the table looks like for our results. So here you can see, actually, cursor in model 1 here, what you can see is that we've included respondent's education, and obviously for the respondent, their own education does have, there is a relationship between kind of having higher levels of education and a lower risk of becoming cognitively impaired at any given time interval. We see that when we look at models of early life conditions on their own, we also see that there's a link here as well. And then we also see for offspring characteristics, so specifically offspring education, the effect sizes are smaller, but there are kind of significant results in that having kind of a greater share of children with a college education does tend to reduce the likelihood of cognitive impairment. when we put everything together, we actually see that the significant relationship between a respondent's parents' education and their own cognitive impairment is no longer significant, but children's education still remains significant, as does the respondent's own education. And then in Model 5 here, we've included kind of health behaviors and pathways, thinking that these might be some of the mechanisms through which children's education matter for parents' health. And we still see a small but still remaining significant effect. So, okay. So then this graph just shows the likelihood of becoming cognitively impaired across all different age groups. Here, my cursor again. Here. And what we wanted to see was kind of whether or not at different age intervals, children's education still mattered. And this graph is basically just looking at, from the parents' perspective, again, whether or not having any children who went to college, having some children who went to college, having no children who went to college. And what we can see is that the difference between parents who have no children who completed college and then parents who have either some or all children who completed college, so these are kind of our most advantaged parents, there is a significant difference kind of in kind of mid to later life, but there's pretty much no difference in the effect of having either one or some or all children who completed college. So this suggests potentially some type of kind of threshold effect, in that really it only takes maybe one child to have kind of that health, that beneficial health effect of reducing cognitive health decline. Okay, so I'm going to move on to study 2 because I'm looking at the time and I realize I don't have so much time left, and I've got a few more slides to cover. So this next study is looking specifically at that Black-white health gap and linking it to parents' dementia risk. So there's 2 things that we're doing that are a little bit different in this study. So the first is looking at the process through which children achieve their education. So in that prior study where we just kind of established that link, we looked only at kind of the benefits, essentially. So thinking about kind of the additive benefits of having more than one child who completed a college education. But we didn't really think about the process through which a child's education is attained. And so in this study, we're thinking more about educational mobility, thinking about whether or not, by mobility, we're defining that as whether or not a child achieves more, less, or the same levels of education than their parents, and then trying to link this to, again, kind of cognitive health outcomes for parents. So race comes into the picture here because in the United States, there are pretty immense differences in rates of intergenerational mobility between Black families and white families. So on the left-hand side here, you can see that in general, there's a lower probability of actually achieving upward mobility. Okay, so for example, for families or for children from the poorest 20% of Americans, you can see that African-American children are much less likely to kind of basically escape these poor social origins compared to white families. Okay. On the other hand, if you look here on the right-hand side, you actually see that downward mobility tends to also be higher for African Americans than for whites. And so here we can see that among kind of the wealthiest 20% of Black and white families, Black children are more likely to experience kind of falling out of that kind of wealthy bracket compared to white families. And so you have these effects would suggest that kind of the processes through which intergenerational education is attained differ for Black and white families. Okay, so what is the research on social mobility and intergenerational mobility and health outcomes? At the individual level, there is some research to suggest kind of different hypotheses surrounding one's own mobility and health outcomes in later life. So there's 3 hypotheses here. So the first is that with respect to individual level effects, studies suggest that studies suggest that for people who experience upward mobility in life, there could actually be better health outcomes because your social conditions have improved, right? So now you have a better job, you might have more income than you did when you were a child, your childhood conditions. That could lead to positive health outcomes. On the other hand, some people also predict kind of increased stress because these individuals, these upwardly mobile individuals, might experience some type of alienation from both their old social origins and their new social origins. And that stress would lead to worse health outcomes. And then the long arm of childhood literature, which emphasizes, again, kind of that earlier period over kind of the present period in life, would actually suggest that those early life conditions really matter the most. And so even though you achieved kind of upward mobility, your early life conditions actually would predict poor health in later life. Research on downward mobility also has a few hypotheses here. So first is kind of this hypothesis about fall from grace, which suggests that people who experience downward social mobility in general will experience immense levels of stress because of kind of this lower social status that they now experience compared to earlier in life. And this would obviously have then negative health outcomes. Alternatively, again, we see kind of that prediction of the long arm of literature, long arm of childhood literature, which would suggest that for these individuals, kind of their present social status doesn't matter as much. And so having that advantaged social status at birth really would actually predict kind of good health in later life, regardless of the social status that they experience as adults. When we look at kind of differences in kind of educational mobility and expectations across racial groups, we actually note some differences. So in prior research has found that Black adults, Black parents in general, express higher academic aspirations for their children compared to white parents. And in a recent Pew study, Black parents were also more likely to report that it was much more important for their children to achieve a college education compared to white parents in terms of thinking about kind of what that college education means as achieving middle class status. So when we think about kind of the effects of intergenerational mobility on parents' cognitive health, we're trying to link together kind of the research that looks at mobility, but not at one's own mobility, but the experience of mobility for children and how that affects parents' health. Okay, and so, as I mentioned before, kind of the processes through which children's education is achieved might matter differently. So for parents whose children achieve kind of upward social mobility, we could expect potentially improvements in parents' health literacy. Okay, so these children being able to kind of navigate kind of complex health environments. This could also affect parents' health behaviors as a whole, which then would also prevent the onset of dementia. Children who experience downward mobility, these parents might be funneling resources to these disadvantaged children, which then draws away from the own resources they could use to kind of protect their own health in later life. So we have kind of a rank ordering of kind of the risk of the hypothesized risk of dementia onset by by children's educational trajectories. So what we're predicting here is that when children have low levels of education and parents have low levels of education, these are kind of disadvantaged parents who then have the highest risk of dementia onset. When we see kind of a situation where children achieve high levels of education and parents do as well, or parents have as well, then we see the lowest risk. And we see kind of something in between for for children who achieve upward mobility, okay? And then also, sorry, I'm like pointing my own cursor on my own screen, but not the screen that you all see. Here we go. Okay, I can't, there we go. And then we see here kind of a lower risk also for children who achieve low levels of education, but who come from kind of high social origins where parents have higher levels of education. So like before, we're using data from the Health and Retirement Study, the HRS study. We use the same data, pretty much the same sample as well. We're looking at dementia onset, which is a little bit different from cognitive impairment in terms of the scaling, but it is kind of a measure of cognitive health in general, but it's a little bit more precise. Our measures of education here do differ. So we're looking at intergenerational mobility, but because we know that educational expansion has occurred over historical time in the United States, it's really not fair to measure children who achieved a college education vis-a-vis parents who achieved a college education. So to do this, we're looking at education of both respondents and children, but kind of vis-a-vis their peers in their same 10-year birth cohort. So for parents, for example, we're looking at whether or not that parent achieved kind of below median levels of education, or median and above levels of education vis-a-vis other parents who were born in that similar time period. And we're doing a similar thing for children as well. Okay, so they're being compared to their own peers, but then also vis-a-vis each other as well. So maybe this makes this graph hopefully is a little bit clearer. So we're looking at parents' education, so whether or not parents have below median levels of education within their 10-year cohort, and then median or higher, and then we're comparing that to children's education here. And I have these terms that I've used to kind of describe the experience of children's educational trajectories vis-a-vis parents. So we have here, for example, when parents have below median levels of education and children have below median levels of education, these are families that experience generational disadvantage. Conversely, you have a situation of upward mobility here when parents have below median levels of education and parents have median or higher levels of education, downward mobility here, and then also generational advantage when kind of both parents and children have higher levels of education vis-a-vis their peers. So the analytical plan is quite similar as before. Again, we're using discrete time event history analysis to look at that movement from kind of being in a state of not having dementia to dementia, and we're stratifying it by race. So just to give you a descriptive table of what kind of our groups look like of these kind of statuses, we can see that basically, oops, sorry, move my cursor again. There we go. We can see that Blacks are less likely to actually experience generational advantage, which is not surprising given kind of historical, institutional racism. What we can see is that white families are more likely to have generational advantage, so being kind of having both parents and children have higher levels of education. We can actually see kind of differential effects here, though, in that whites are slightly more likely to experience downward mobility. And here we can see that African Americans are more likely to experience kind of upward mobility than whites. And obviously this comes because there are kind of significant both, I guess, floor and ceiling effects in that African Americans are starting at a much lower level of education than their parents are. And so that's why we see, for example, higher rates of upward mobility for African American families. And then this graph here is the only graph that I'm going to present for this study, but basically there is a lot to unpack here. So what we can see is that basically across all of the levels of children's educational transitions, we see that white families are less likely to experience the onset of dementia compared to Black families. And this isn't so surprising. I mentioned earlier that Black older adults are much more likely to experience dementia onset. So what we see is that kind of regardless of kind of children's educational trajectories, it still remains the same. Two things to note, though, is that the gap between Black and white parents is actually largest at kind of these less or generationally disadvantaged families. So when parents and children have low levels of education, we can see that the gap between Black and white families is the largest. And then the last thing to note is that the gradient for cognitive health, for dementia onset, is actually much smaller for these for white families compared to African American families. And what this suggests is that because the gradient is much larger for African American families, is that when you do have children who achieve higher levels of education than their parents, for example, there is a larger drop in dementia risk compared to white families. And so here it's suggestive that of the fact that education really is a modifiable resource and can be a really important resource for parents, and in particular, African American families. So I'm just going to conclude by saying that the results that we see kind of confirmed the hypotheses that we have, and in particular, the most important hypothesis that we put out there was that the health of Black parents is more sensitive to the educational trajectories of their children than white parents. Do I have enough time to go into these next few slides, Katie, or do you want me to stop?
Yeah, I think you've got maybe 3 more minutes, if that's okay.
Okay, but that's all I need. Okay, so I just want to mention that when we're talking about educational mobility, there are 2 things to kind of keep in the back of one's mind. So this graph here is just looking at kind of long-term trajectories in upward mobility for African Americans compared to whites. And what we see is that although African Americans are overall less likely to experience upward mobility, that gap is closing, which is really positive news for people who care about kind of racial disparities in mobility, but also now that I've shown you hopefully some convincing links to mobility and family health or parents' health, this is positive news. The bad news is that we might be seeing a plateau. And so this graph here is basically just showing kind of rates of college completion across different racial groups in the United States. And so what we can see actually is that even though, cursor again, about, it's like, okay. Even though we see that kind of rates of college completion are increasing for African Americans, they're also increasing for whites as well. And so that gap is actually not really closing in terms of educational completion. And so one wonders if we're actually going to see kind of an actual closure of this prior graph that I showed to you, which is rates of upward mobility. So the takeaway here is that we know that kind of through historical injustices and institutional racism, that we have lower levels of intergenerational mobility among African Americans compared to whites. But we also see kind of the positive effects of this intergenerational mobility on kind of health outcomes at the family level, and that this might be kind of useful in thinking about closing the racial gap in health outcomes for older adults when we kind of take kind of a broader look at not just individual resources, but family resources as well. I'll end by saying that the next steps to this are looking at kind of different robustness checks, testing for kind of how we measure adult children's education, that cutoff that I mentioned earlier for educational mobility, and then also trying to tackle some of the indigeneity issues that are really present in this study and any types of studies that looks at children's education and parents' health. And one way that we predict we could do this is through propensity score matching. So thanks so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Jenjira. That was really fabulous, really fascinating. So, and very well done for keeping to time. Thank you. So actually, this is really wonderful. We do have some time, hopefully, where we can get some questions. So people can either feel welcome. Oh, I already see Rachel has her hand up. So I'll go straight to Rachel. You can unmute yourself, Rachel. So we've got Rachel first, then Kate, and then I'll take other questions as they come.
Thanks.
Okay.
So thanks, Jenjira. I love your work, and I'm really happy that you presented both these projects today. I'm also very grateful about your tip about how to look at cognitive impairment among proxy respondents in the HRS. So thank you. I have a question or sort of like comment, I guess, like about an issue that relates to both of the papers, and it's about like thinking about how kids are important. And like one of the ways in which we know parents are really important for kids' cognitive development is like the number of words that are spoken to kids, right? Like if you actually have studies that like add up the numbers and like the variety of words, that's like a really great predictor of like, you know, kids' readiness for kindergarten and like being ready to read. And so I wonder if like there are any papers that you know of that are sort of look at these parent-child dynamics in later life, and whether you could capture some of that with the HRS. So like in addition to knowing like the adult children's education, you also know about like contact between parents and adult children, and like whether the highly educated kid is actually the one like interacting with the parent a lot. And I wonder if you sort of were able to isolate that, if you might even find like even stronger results there. Because really like education is, in this case, is like useful for a lot of reasons, but for cognitive health, it could just be like the way and like the intensity of interaction, right?
Yeah, that's a great point, Rachel, thank you. So we have, not in this study, but in other studies that I've done, using actually Mexican data, we have looked at parent-child interaction, so frequency of parent-child interaction. It doesn't really get at kind of, I think, all the nuances of what you're talking about.
Right.
And even when we include that, we do see still kind of a net effect, I guess, of children's education on kind of improving parents' cognitive health scores. But in the HRS data, we've used kind of different controls for geographic proximity. One of the problems that I've been trying to kind of wrap my mind around is that, you know, in the second study that I showed you today, actually it only looks at the education of one child. But in the prior studies, we've been trying to account for the education of all of the children. Right. And obviously that has its benefits, right? Because you're thinking about the family as a whole and children as a subset. But when you look at children as a whole, then you can't look at the behavior of all the children. Like it's just right. Like, you know, how do you do that? So I think in this study that, you know, the second study that I propose now, this work in progress, we will be able to dig a little bit deeper by looking just at that one child's behavior. And I know the HRS does have some measures. They are somewhat crude, but we could get at some of these things.
Yeah, I think that'd be really interesting, but I love the work in general.
Well, thank you so much.
Thanks, Rachel. Okay, so I know we have Kate next, and then we'll go to Howard after that.
So great talk, Jenjira. This is great. I had two questions. The first question that I had was if you were able to look at caregiving responsibilities. So one of the reasons why you may have a cognitive difference between Black and white, for example, maybe because African Americans, we know that they have to care, higher shares of them care for their grandchildren, higher shares of them are also caring for the older parents because of their family arrangement. And then the second question, I might have three different points, is I wonder if your results would differ if you look at income instead of educational attainment, and whether or not the relative income actually goes up and down, given the fact that the returns to education differs between whites and Blacks. And then finally, and I know you know I'm going to ask this question, is about the impact of spousal characteristics. So some African Americans have much lower marriage rates. We also see differences in educational sorority mating patterns and so forth. So those were my questions. Great talk.
Thanks, Kate. So your first point about kind of Black-white differences in caregiving responsibilities, we have not controlled for, I mean, this gets at some of Rachel's point as well, and thinking about kind of what it is about children's education and who is kind of the person who's responsible for caring for the older parent. But that earlier point that the other point you brought about, which is thinking about the parent themselves and caregiving for kind of younger generations, so like grandchildren, and how those ties might kind of playing into being cognitively healthy. We haven't thought about that. So that's actually something that's a great suggestion. We can control for that. We know we have kind of grandparent status in the HRS. So those are things and we know how much time people spend with their grandkids, right? I think there's some measure of that. So we could possibly look at that as well. We haven't looked at this with income. I've only looked at education. So that's possibly another robustness check to do. The only problem is that with the HRS, the measures of children's income is pretty crude. I think there's like a cutoff of like $35,000 or more per year, which is not, I mean, and I think that actually the dollar amount also stays constant too. So not really taking into account kind of differences across cohorts. And the last point, the impact of the spousal education. No, we have not looked at that. Other reviewers have suggested that we do that, include spousal education as a control. We do control for marital status, but we don't control for spousal education. One thing, though, that your point kind of brings up is thinking possibly about step versus biological children. So you talked about kind of different rates of marriage, and then I was thinking about remarriage as well. And that has been kind of an idea that I've been thinking about is, you know, we talk about children kind of very kind of broadly here, but we know that there are lots of differences in the types of supports that biological versus stepchildren provide. And so that might be also a next step in this area as well.
Great, thank you. Okay, so Howard, you're next.
Thank you very much, Jenjira. I have to say it's hard to ask a question after Rachel and Kate. I'm running out of material here to ask you a question, but it's very much related to the same kind of questions that they're asking, which is considering some of the things that might mediate or moderate education to the parent. And so some additional things are like if you can measure just social ties. So you may not need your family if you have a good group of folks who you're interacting with, and kind of to the verbal element that Rachel's talking about. You know, food security would be another one. So they're certainly correlated with education and income, but it would be kind of interesting if that's you know, something that can be explored with that data or not. And so I was wondering if those are measures that could be incorporated, or if you've been thinking about some of that.
So social ties, I'm trying to think. I think that there are modules in the health and retirement study that ask kind of broader questions about social ties. It's certainly not asked every 2 years. That's my understanding of the data. But there are modules that look at kind of broader social networks. And so your point is really a good one. Like, you know, I focus so much on intergenerational relationships, and, you know, hopefully I gave you those slides that made you feel compelled that this is an important family relationship. But one of the things that we know is that in general, kind of family demography, we're aware of the fact that fertility is declining and more people are childless, right, by choice. And so what happens when you have kind of a cohort of people who are becoming older now, who don't have kind of the family networks? What do other people provide? So this is a great question, and we haven't, to be honest, we have not thought much about it. But thank you, and that's something definitely to look into.
That's great. So we have a few minutes left. I don't know if anybody else. Oh yeah, Yoko, I see, has her hand up.
Hi, nice to meet you, Jenjira, and thank you very much for the great talk. I really enjoyed, you know, your two projects. And this is something that I was wondering, or maybe you can clarify if I misunderstood out of your presentation, which is about the measures of educational mobility in the second talk. If I remember correctly and understood your material correctly, I think you were using a kind of relative position, like relative mobility. And I was kind of curious, like, you know, when we think about the education effect onto people's life. So it's one thing that you've fallen off or achieve upper mobility relative to others. But however, like when we think about education, like absolute kind of measures, so comparing the specific levels of education. So the high school graduate parents versus university graduate. So that kind of like levels of skill set might be slightly different if you know. So I think relative mobility works well as long as the you know, the people's levels of education is constant. However, it seems to me that it's kind of moving. So I was kind of wondering if you do use the absolute measures of mobility in education, it might slightly, like, it might have a different, slightly different changes, etc. Or
Yeah.
maybe you can just, yeah, tell me, like,
No,
if
no,
you
that's
could clarify.
that's a great point. So we, so in this study, you're right, we do use these relative measures, but in prior work, we've used absolute measures of children's education and parents' education. But we've basically just done interactions, which is not the same thing as what we have done here, which is to kind of have these actual trajectories. I mean, one of the reasons we use these relative measures is because we assume that because education has been expanding in the United States.
Yes.
That it's better to use these relative measures, but again, this is like a good robustness check, and maybe it does give us different, responses. I worry a little bit about, especially kind of higher levels of education, particularly because for our cohorts that we're looking at for African American families, there's very small percentages of people who have kind of this generational advantage. So people who have parents with a college education and then children with a college education. Mm-hmm. So our cell sizes become smaller, at least for those earlier cohorts. But it's a good point. And if we could do it maybe for the later cohorts, we might see something different. But it's a good check. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for a great talk.
Okay. I think that was perfect timing. Jenjira, you're very articulate. Thank you. You've given really great answers to those questions. So I think with that, we'll draw this colloquium series to an end. And I just want to, again, extend our thanks to Dr. Yahirun for really, really fabulous talk, 2 really fascinating projects. Hopefully you've all been able to see that Amy has posted a link to the most recent of Dr. Yahirun's publications, so you can access that there. But thanks again so much, and everyone enjoy the rest of your weekend and happy Halloween.